All right, we can get started. Today we're going to talk about 401ks, when to roll them over, and just how to evaluate them in general, and also target date funds, which are, target retirement, 2040, 2030, all those kind of funds. We're going to talk about some advantages and disadvantages of target date funds. The disclaimer, always have to go through this. None of the data is a personal recommendation to anyone here because we don't take into account your individual situation. All the information is accurate as of the date I looked at it, but of course it can change. So if you're coming back a year from now, just be cautious. And a little additional for this one, we actually are showing some analyses. So the analyses presented here are only focused on lowering investment costs. It doesn't take into account your individual tax situation. You can lower tax a lot of times by asset placement within your portfolio. So if you have taxable accounts, non-taxable, and tax-deferred accounts, this does not address that. So first we're just going to do an introduction on employer-sponsored retirement plans. We'll talk about how many people are in 401ks, how large the 401k market is, why we are focusing on investment costs in this, and we'll compare some good and bad 401ks at two companies in Houston that I'm familiar with. We'll talk about what I call the power of aggregation and how that can benefit your portfolio. And then as far as target date funds are concerned, we'll show you the top 3 fund families, like Vanguard, Fidelity, and T. Rowe Price are the top 3 target date funds, are the ones you'll most likely see in your 401ks. And they comprise 75% of the market for target date funds. And so we'll talk about some issues concerning risk diversification, and expenses of target date funds. So, how many Americans participate in 401ks? So there was 52 million American workers in roughly 515,000 401k plans. So of all salary and wage workers, 59% do not participate in their 401ks and 41% do. And a lot of that's because, right, a lot of them are hourly wage earners, and a lot of those workers don't participate. And then the next one is just how large are 401ks. So if you have retirement assets that aren't like pensions, defined benefit plans, defined contribution plans are where you take on the risk, you're responsible for the investment. Defined benefit is the company takes on the risk and they provide you a certain amount every month in retirement. So excluding the pension and defined benefit plans, 401ks make up roughly 1/3 of all retirement assets. IRAs are half, and the other 1/6 is just 403bs. A lot of hospitals have 403bs and stuff like that, which are similar to 401ks. So why are we focusing on investment costs here? It's because actively managed funds, you'll see a lot of actively managed funds in your 401k options. Actively managed funds fail to beat their benchmarks most of the time. And a big reason is because they have very high costs. Actively funds can be paid over 1% for managing your investments. And whereas passive funds and ETS fees are a lot of times they can be lower than 0.1%. I mean, that's a huge difference. 86% of active large cap fund managers failed to beat their benchmarks. So all these active fund managers charging a lot of high fees saying they can beat the market, almost 90% of them don't. And and that was just in 2014, and over the past 10 years, it's not like if you go back further that they're beating it, 82% of them don't. So it's really best to focus on the 2 things that hurt and are going to hit your portfolio are costs and taxes. In this presentation, we're only focusing on costs. This next slide shows the impact of high costs. So if you invested $20,000 each year in the S&P 500 for the past 25 years, you would have invested $500,000. And then if you paid, this shows the difference between paying 1% costs and 1.5% costs. So if you paid 0.5% less, you would have had $87,000 more in earnings in the bottom right there. And you paid $46,000 less in fees to your fund manager or investment manager, whoever you're paying. And the $87,000 comes because that compounds with returns. And so now we're just going to compare. So I have a variety of clients, and I've chosen 2 of 401ks that I've seen. One good one bad one. We obviously won't tell you the names of the employers, but just generally 401ks are limited in their investment options. You'll get a list from your employer saying these are what you can invest in. So a lot of times when you leave that employer, people are left wondering whether they should roll it to an IRA or leave it. So we're trying to show by comparing these two good and bad 401ks, one that we might leave it and one where we might move it. As we said earlier, investment expenses and taxes are the biggest deterrent to long-term gains. Generally, and so this is a broad statement, but generally it holds true. Larger employers, because of economies of scale and purchasing power, they have better 401ks. You know, they can go to their custodian and say, look, you need to lower our investment costs for our employees, spread that over all our employees. Smaller companies can't do that. So a lot of times the smaller companies will have higher expenses, and generally, if you're at a smaller company, it's better to move it to an IRA. So with a focus on lowering costs, we're going to compare these two Houston-based companies, and then we'll also compare it to if you moved it to a Vanguard IRA. So this first company is a relatively small company, less than 2,500 employees. They actually had more investment choices than the larger company, but you can see the average expense ratio of all their investment choices was 0.84%. The highest was 1.35 and the lowest was 0.05. So I would say even though it's not a great 401k, there are still some good choices within that plan. So you need to look, again, you need to focus on costs and you need to get your allocation right in your retirement portfolio. And we'll talk about the power of aggregation later. So for example, in company 2, greater than 10,000 employees, only 11 choices, but the average expense ratio is 0.4. That's more in line with what I try to get people down to 0.4 or less. So this is certainly in the ballpark. And then you can see if you moved it to an IRA, the average expense for what I would say your reasonable investment choices are, you could get it down to 0.14% if you moved it to an IRA. And your highest expense choice in the IRA would be 0.34 at Vanguard and as low as 0.09. So very low at Vanguard. Vanguard's really come onto the scene here in the last 20 years, and they've increased retirement assets certainly at a better rate than any other custodian, better than Fidelity, Schwab. They're ramping up because of their low-cost choices. So this blue, I highlighted this blue part right here. We'll talk about this on the next slide, is that, so let's say that you're still at your employer, right? And you're still contributing to your 401k. It probably doesn't make sense to roll it over every year. I mean, ideally you would if you're in a bad one, but you're still contributing, so you're gonna have to keep rolling it and keep rolling it, and we understand that's a pain, so you're probably not gonna do that. So if you're forced to leave it there, you can still evaluate your 401k, use it to get what the best choices are there, and then use your IRA and other assets to fill in the gaps. Like if it has a bad bond fund, use your other assets to buy bonds. Does that make sense? So, and then also the part below the blue, I'm just showing this for diversification purposes. Does this company have access to real estate? Does it have access to emerging market bonds? And as you can see, a lot of times 401ks don't have all the diversification that I would recommend for people's portfolios. None of these companies had an emerging market bond choice. And so this next slide goes into a little bit what I talked about, the ideal world versus the real world. The investment options at your current employer 401k may be lacking, and it may make sense to switch it, but of course you want to still maybe get a company match. A lot of times people match 0.25% up to 4% or whatever, so you want to still contribute to get that match, so it might not make sense to roll it over every year because it's administrative hassle. So this is where we'll talk about the power of aggregation. So this first slide on the power of aggregation shows two hypothetical 401ks. So it says John and Jane, but we'll say James and Jen. So let's say James' 401k had all high expense options except for his domestic stock fund. And Jen's 401k had all high cost options except for her foreign stock fund. And then they also had an IRA. And and in talking with them, let's say that they plan on retiring around the same age. Most of the times I've found that most couples plan to retire around the same age. It's not like one will say, I want to retire 15 years before you, And then that kind of leads to an argument. Most times, generally, especially if they're both working, they generally fall in retirement around the same age. So why not use the retirement assets to focus on that same goal of retiring in, whenever it may be, 20, 30 years from now. So the next slide just shows, by looking at all your accounts together, this is not necessarily all the asset categories I suggest you invest in. This is just for simplification purposes. If you wanted to get in domestic stock, foreign stock, investment grade, and high yield bonds, you could select, this is what they're highlighted in blue here, you would select the low cost domestic stock fund from James 401k, the foreign stock fund from Jen's, and then you would lower, to replace all those higher cost options, you use their IRA to supplement. And so the result is a portfolio that has all low cost options. And so this is how, when people come to me, this is the biggest thing I do for them from an investment standpoint. I lower their investment costs. So I'll evaluate their 401ks, I'll evaluate, where their gaps are. And most of the time, most people I'd say come to me with an average expense ratio of around 1%, and I lower it to like 0.3 to 0.2. So that pays for most of my fee. I mean, my fee's around, at the highest, 0.8. So a lot of times I can pay for at least half, if not all of my fee, just through this. So then, so that's basically it on the 401ks. So you really need to, I guess in summary on the 401ks, you really need to evaluate I would focus on expenses and see which options are really good. A lot of times they'll have index funds in there. Those are very good options. And then using your other assets to supplement where you may be lacking. And certainly if you're maybe at a smaller company and they don't have very many good options, go ahead and roll that to an IRA, and you can get set up with very good options in the IRA, because there's no limit. There's virtually no limit. You can't invest in life insurance and collectibles, but you can invest in anything else in an IRA. So now we'll talk about target date funds. So these are very common in your 401ks. A lot of times you'll see target date, 2010 to 2050. You'll see all these different target date funds. They're relatively new. Last 20 years they've really come around. So how they work is they're really aggressive as you're far out from your target retirement date. So like a target retirement 2040 is going to be more in equities and less in bonds. And then as you get closer to your target retirement date, more conservative. You don't want to lose money as you get close, so they invest more conservatively and more safer. So the pros, right, are that you can set it and forget it. You don't have to worry about timing the market. You let them worry about reallocating your funds over time. And a lot of times they have lower expense ratios and more actively managed funds, because they're not sitting there trying to pick, I think Walmart's going to outperform the large cap category. They're not doing that. They're just index funds. So the cons is that of the three that we'll look at that contain 2/3 to 3/4 of the market, some of their expense ratios are still way too high for index funds. Like we said, index funds you can get down to 0.3%. So you'll see one of these ones has a way too high expense ratio. And you'll see that they have a lack of diversification, and a lot of times they're not, all the time, they're not tailored to your risk tolerance, right? Everyone invests in target date 2040, but Jen, you might not be the same as me. You might be more risk averse. So instead of this glide path that they have you on, you might want to be more like this. So it's not tailored to your individual risk preference. So this next slide is comparing the top 3 custodians for target date funds. There's the T. Rowe Price, Fidelity, and Vanguard. And then I also show it, the composed column is how I would allocate people's funds if they came to me. And it shows that if they were in a Vanguard IRA, the funds I would invest them in to get them to their desired allocation profile. So just the yellow, as we showed on the previous page, yellow was going to be expense, risk was going to be red, and then we'll show diversification issues in blue. So just looking at the T. Rowe Price 2040, you can see it has an expense ratio of 0.75%. To me, that's way too high. That's unbelievably high. Compared to Fidelity and Vanguard, those are both under 0.2%. That's a big difference. We talked about earlier how much 0.5%, that's more than 0.5% can cost you. That being said, people will say, well look, T. Rowe Price gave me a 6.73 annualized return over the past 5 years. Yeah, whereas Vanguard and Fidelity were lower than that. So yeah, I'll pay for that. Well, what you're not thinking about is that you're taking on more risk. As you can see, T. Rowe prices, the reason is not that they're more expensive and better at selecting, it's that you're in more risky assets. So the risk over the last 5 years was almost 12%, whereas Vanguard and Fidelity were 9 and 11. And that might not seem like a big difference, but when you start getting into a market, this doesn't go back to 2008, it's only the last 5 years. When you start getting to downturns, you'll care about that risk. And so the blue down here, we're still just talking about the first three. The blue, this shows how they're allocated over these different asset categories. So T. Rowe Price, Fidelity, and Vanguard, as you can see, they're not invested in real estate, they're not invested in commodities. And as far as bonds go, they have very little exposure to foreign bonds and very little exposure to high yield bonds. And I would argue that at, far out from retirement, you can have some exposure to foreign bonds and high yield bonds. They're more risky than a normal bond profile. So, and you're far out, so you can afford to be allocated to them. So that's where on the compose column, my column, I would allocate people to commodities and real estate, and I would allocate people to foreign bonds and high yield bonds. And you can see the benefit of that. I mean, we all know, we always hear diversification is better, right? Lowers risk. Well, this clearly shows it. So in my column, the risk is 8.42%, significantly lower than the other three. And the return is not much different. And we actually beat the Fidelity return and close to Vanguard, a percent under T. Rowe Price, but we all talked about the different, T. Rowe Price is a little riskier. And so this one shows the target date funds that are past. You're already in retirement. T. Rowe Price is still the most expensive choice, 0.6%. I would not recommend that generally. Vanguard and Fidelity, great target date funds as far as expense ratios go. T. Rowe Price still has the highest risk, and as you can see, these funds are still not allocated towards commodities, real estate, and global and high yield bonds, even in retirement. And so that's an area I say we could further diversify and again lower your risk and not give up too much return. So that's the summary. Not all 401ks are created equal. Careful attention should be paid toward expense ratios. When you're evaluating a 401k, I would say that's the top thing I would look at is what are the expense ratios of your different funds. You can look at the 10-year returns and 5-year returns, but in reality, if it's a higher return, you're probably taking on more risk. So it's better to focus on cost. And careful, convenience may trump, I think I was watching a debate when I wrote the sentence. Convenience may trump idealism when deciding to roll an IRA. That's just saying, again, if you're already contributing to get a match, it's probably not ideal to roll it every year. So in that case, use the power of aggregation to get your portfolio right. Choose the low cost options in your 401ks and supplement with your IRAs. And the last one I'll say, don't forget about taxes and asset allocation. We don't discuss that here, but generally, you can improve your tax situation by allocating your assets properly between taxable, tax deferred, and tax-free accounts. And so target date funds, not all target date funds are created equal either. We've shown that. High expenses, risk, returns, all that, and diversification. And so you need to keep an eye. The biggest thing is you need to keep an eye on how you're allocated. So another example which I didn't talk about here was there was a study that was done with people who are invested in target date funds. More than 60% of people also were invested in non-target date funds. So that right there tells me you've already thrown off your asset allocation. So if you're in a target date fund, it's already allocated across those asset categories. And then let's say you're in your taxable account that you're also using for retirement, you're invested in a large cap fund. Well, now you're overweighted towards large cap funds, right? So 60% of people don't do it right. If you're going to be in a target fund, you need to also have that other stuff targeted correctly too, not just invested in a large cap fund that's going to throw off your asset allocation. That's it. The appendixes just show kind of what the hypothetical IRA I talked about, and the target date fund I talked about. It actually shows you what I would have invested in to get to that target date fund. And that's it. Pretty short and sweet. We generally like to keep it like that. Yeah, any questions?
So how do I know what the cost of my funds?
Right, so your employer has to provide you with your investment options, and if a lot of times you can either find it online or they'll give you a handout at the beginning of the year, whenever your open enrollment is, a lot of times they'll give you a sheet that says, oh, by the way, here's your 401k options. And that sheet always should have the expense ratios on it. You should be, and if it's not there, you should be able to find it online. It is a little hard to go, like if it doesn't have it, that's where people get confused it is a lot of research. You might have to go dig for it, but you can find it. And I would ask certainly your HR department would know, if you just say, hey, look, I see these are my investment options, but what do they cost? They have to show you. They'll be able to provide you something. James, Jen, any questions? Good?